They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death, and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms. But it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. This was never truer than in our first lost treasure, which was one of the greatest discoveries ever made by a paleontologist. However, the 67-million-year-old find in the Black Hills of South Dakota that should have afforded acclaim and accolades to his finders brought nothing but trouble and suspicion.
When we talk about buried treasure and cursed treasure, we tend to think about collections of gold and silver objects, of jewels. What we don't tend to think about is a treasure that's 40 foot high and 13 feet long and has been in the earth 67 million years. Yet that's exactly what was pulled from the dirt and the soil of the Black Hills in South Dakota in August 1990. The largest ever intact T-Rex dinosaur. In doing so, that team became engulfed by what some people like to believe is a curse.
T-Rex is the most famous, the most iconic celebrity dinosaur of all. I think it deserves all the hyperbole that's thrust at it because this was one of the most fantastic creatures that has ever lived.
T-Rex lived about 66, 67 million years ago, so right at the end of the time of the dinosaurs. T-Rex would have seen the dinosaur extinction, lived across North America, and completely dominated its ecosystem.
It also was a smart dinosaur. It had a big brain. It had keen senses. So that made T-Rex the ultimate dinosaur predator, and I think the biggest and baddest thing that has ever lived on land, at least in the entire history of the Earth.
The T-Rex was discovered in South Dakota in August 1990 by American explorer and fossil collector Sue Hendrickson. And although it is not known whether the specimen is male or female, it was named Sue after its discoverer.
Now, Sue Hendrickson was part of a team that was out prospecting for fossils in South Dakota. And as the story goes, that crew was just about to pack up for the summer, but one of their trucks got a flat tire, so some of the crew went into town to fix that tire. Sue stayed back just to do a little bit more fossil prospecting, and she saw some dinosaur bones on the ground, just bits of bone.
Sue Hendrickson uncovered enough of the skeleton to know that this was an incredible find. So when Peter Lawson, the leader of the Black Hills Institute of Geological Research, got back from fixing the truck, she called him to see her discovery.
This was almost intact. It had lain in the dirt there for 67 million years and had somehow survived almost without damage.
Pete Larson brought them back to his museum and his lab in Rapid City, South Dakota. And he set about conserving those bones.
It's actually really rare to find even half a skeleton of a dinosaur. And Sue is 70+% complete, with missing a bit of a foot, a few ribs, the end of a tail, and that's about it. So you've got an almost complete skeleton, and it's of a particularly large individual, and at the time was considered the largest T-Rex ever found.
The team spent about $1 million cleaning the skeleton and getting it ready to put on display. But before they could do that, a remarkable incident happened.
The FBI turned up at the Black Hills Institute and were looking at all of the collections and looking through the fossils, and they actually came to take Sue away.
But the federal government didn't just seize, impound Sue the T-Rex. It also threw the legal book at Peter Larson, the founder and owner of the Black Hills Institute. There was then, and there remains to this day, a real concern about commercial treasure hunters, dinosaur bone hunters. And the fear is that because they're commercial enterprises, they're in it for the money. Now, Peter Larson, in fairness, has a degree in paleontology. None of that mattered. The feds threw the book at him. A succession of charges that he had been trafficking illegally in dinosaur bones.
Remarkable. This just doesn't normally happen with dinosaurs. And they were put in a secure location at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. They were put under lock and key so that Pete and Sue and others couldn't see them. And this was all because there was a dispute about who the true owner of this fossil actually was.
Initially, when Sue was found by Susan Hendrickson, she was found on the property of Maurice Williams, who owned the land, and the Black Hills Institute with Peter, they paid Maurice $5,000.
And it was, from what I understand, more of a handshake agreement, the kind of thing that happens oftentimes when you're out looking for fossils on land that's owned by other people. You don't know, as a paleontologist, what you're going to find. So it's hard to really promise a landowner a certain price. Then it became even more complicated because Mr. Williams is a member of the Sioux tribe, and his land was actually held in trust by the US government. So then the government got involved. As you can imagine, the courts were the only way to untangle this complicated web that surrounded this tyrannosaur.
The trial was as mired in controversy as everything else had been. The government's own witnesses denied that Peter Larson had broken the law. And there were persistent criticisms of the judge for a perceived conflict of interest. Then, when Larson was convicted, he was convicted of just 2 charges, and the normal sentence would have been probation. In fact, he got 2 years in prison. He spent those 2 years behind bars, and when he got out, his marriage collapsed, and he himself said that he spent at least 6 months in a very dark mental place. All of this had been visited on him in the wake of digging up Sue the T-Rex.
Ultimately, the courts ruled that Maurice Williams was the rightful owner of Sue. Now, this meant that Pete Larson lost his crown jewel T-Rex, and he ended up being convicted on a couple of counts that really had nothing to do with the details of Sue. They didn't have to do with illegally collecting Sue or trespassing or anything like that. They were counts that were unrelated, but things that were dug up when he was being investigated.
So quite tragically, not only was Sue then taken away, and Peter Larson and the Black Hills Institute, their credibility was kind of muddied through the water. It was really, really bad for them. But on top of that, because Maurice then decided that he had the rights to sell it, he then put it in an open auction where there was a really serious possibility that Sue could be sold to a private individual and completely lost to science.
On October the 5th, 1997, Sue sold for $8.36 million. And luckily for science, she was purchased by the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois, where she went on display for the entire world to see on May the 17th, 2000. Maurice Williams and the Field Museum were clearly the big winners. But what happened to the woman who found this magnificent creature in the first place?
Sue Hendrickson also found herself under the spotlight. She was suspected by the federal government of stealing dinosaur bones from government-owned lands. And she became so fearful, it took such a toll, that she cut off all contact with her colleagues. And in the end, she walked away from the dinosaur hunting business entirely. She too seems to have suffered misfortune in the wake of digging up this extraordinary T-Rex skeleton.
Is there any curse attached to Sue? I would say that there probably is some curses attached to Sue. If I speak for Peter Larson and the Black Hills Institute and Susan Hendrickson, I'm sure that they would agree there's a major curse attached to Sue.
Some curses are so well known that they become part of our culture and spawn books, documentaries, and successful film franchises. One such curse began with the burial of a boy king over 3,000 years ago in Egypt.
In November 1922, the British archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the tomb of the boy king, the pharaoh Tutankhamun, in the sands of the west bank of the Nile. The treasure of Tutankhamun has become the biggest draw in archaeological history ever. And the most famous pieces of Tutankhamun's treasures, particularly the face mask, have become so well known, so well publicized, that they now serve almost as a shorthand for the entire rule of pharaohs in ancient Egypt.
But the invaluable treasure was not the only thing believed to have been brought back from beyond the grave by this remarkable discovery. As the seal was broken on the tomb, some of the ancient magic that had been buried with the pharaoh for over 3,000 years allegedly escaped to weave its mysterious spell once again.
Arguably the most famous curse in the world is the so-called curse of Tutankhamun. It was alleged that after the tomb had been opened and excavated, that many of the people who were involved in that event very shortly afterwards met their deaths.
It was the Victorian obsession with all things Egyptian which started the frenzied archaeological exploration of the Valley of the Kings.
The Valley of the Kings is the principal royal cemetery. Every Egyptian king and some other important people were buried in tombs hidden in the Valley of the Kings.
Tutankhamun's was a tomb that was missing. So archaeologists would have been aware that a little bit more digging might yet uncover that tomb.
A British archaeologist called Howard Carter was based in Egypt and soon found himself in the right place at the right time.
By around about 1914-15, he came to have a concession to work in the valley, and of course it's this that would lead him to eventually to make his great discovery.
Under the sponsorship of the aristocratic Lord Carnarvon, Carter would embark on a project that would catapult them both into the annals of history.
Lord Carnarvon took an interest in Egyptian archaeology. He dabbled in collecting and in his own excavations, and through that he became friends with Howard Carter.
They came across the step, a stone step which was the top of a staircase. When they'd cleared the staircase down to the tomb, they discovered the top of a doorway, and the doorway was still sealed, and it was piercing that doorway and shining light into that little hole that Carter got his first glimpse of what the tomb contained.
Carnarvon, perhaps impatiently, says to him, "Can you see anything?" To which Carter replies, yes, wonderful things. There would have been a moment when Carter stepped into the antechamber, as he called it, for the first time, the first room in the sequence of 4 that the tomb comprises, and he would have found it completely full to bursting with ancient material, crammed full of fantastic ancient objects, all more or less in place as they had been left 3,500 years before.
In his burial chamber, there were a whole series of layers before you actually get to the royal mummy. You had 4 golden shrines, and then you have the sarcophagus, the quartzite sarcophagus, in which there were a nest of 3 more coffins, human-shaped, gold-covered, with the mummy of Tutankhamun at the very heart of all this, with the famous gold mask over his head.
That moment must have been fantastic. The culmination of all Carter's and Carnarvon's hopes. But it was also the start of a journey that neither of them expected.
The story of the curse of Tutankhamun dates almost from the time when the tomb was opened. Stories began proliferating in the press that people who had been associated either with the excavation or with the examination of the artifacts thereafter had begun to die in mysterious circumstances. 5 months after the tomb was opened, the Earl of Carnarvon, who had financed the excavation, died unexpectedly at the young age of 56 in Cairo. And according to popular rumour, at the very moment when he died, all the lights in the city went out. Shortly after that, an Egyptian prince associated with it was shot dead by his wife, and then the man who had x-rayed the tomb died in mysterious circumstances. That was followed by Howard Carter's secretary. Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, waded in. He ascribed to the tomb and to the opening some kind of curse associated with a malevolent deity.
I think there was always the idea, at least in popular Western culture, from at least the late 19th century, that the excavation of tombs through archaeology was somehow a kind of benighted, dangerous thing to do.
Dateline, Egypt, February 16th, 1923. An English archaeological expedition headed by a man named Howard Carter sought to uncover the tomb of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, King Tutankhamun. Hanging over the excavation party was a pall of superstition that threatened the progress of the expedition at every turn. The native laborers felt sure that this desecration of early graves would bring only tragedy to all involved.
It's everywhere now, the idea of cursed Egyptian mummies and treasures. It's in Hollywood. Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Mummy 1, The Mummy 2. It's all based around this notion that what was dug out of the sand in the Valley of the Kings was in some way cursed. Is there any evidence for it? Well, yes, actually there is. For once, there is something which might approach some kind of evidence. Some of the tombs did have what appear to be curses inscribed on them.
Ancient Egyptian tombs occasionally were decorated on the exterior or at the entranceway with inscriptions warding off intruders. Tombs were not supposed to be violated, and we do have examples of inscriptions saying, you know, if anyone shall disturb this tomb, then, you know, such and such misfortune will befall them.
The ancient Egyptians were fascinated by magic. They believed it played a part in their everyday life, and perhaps more importantly, in the afterlife.
The priests, the elite who were being buried at this time, They did have an understanding of sorcery, they had an understanding of magic. This is referred to in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance. And so there may well have been some kind of curse placed on specific tombs at this time.
It seems very plausible to people who want to believe in a curse that there might be such a thing in an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. So it didn't take very much, and certainly the death of somebody very closely involved with the tomb, like Lord Carnarvon, would be enough, I think, for people to think that, well, yeah, obviously this is to do with a curse.
It's interesting that people often say there must be something to do with a curse when it comes to Tutankhamun, because so many people involved in the rediscovery of his tomb in 1922 died soon after in mysterious circumstances. There must be a curse. But it's also worth remembering that until fairly recently, most archaeologists, certainly the ones who worked in Egypt, were elderly gentlemen. Some of them, like Lord Carnarvon himself, went out to Egypt on the advice of doctors initially because he already had serious health problems.
Why do we believe that the handful of people who did die in mysterious, unexplained, or slightly dubious circumstances, why do we assume that they're the victims of a curse? The one certain thing in all of this pantheon of myth and curse mythology is that no newspaper editor and no newspaper publisher ever went broke by publishing fanciful stories of mysterious supernatural curses dating from millennia before. It's a surefire way of boosting circulation and sales. That, in my view, is the origin of the curse of Tutankhamun.
The finding of the tomb of Tutankhamun wasn't just the first big archaeological story in history. It was the first big news story in history.
Visitors flocked to the open tomb, attracted as much by the legendary curse as of the chance to step into a chamber of the far distant past.
The glamour, the gold was absolutely spectacular. It absolutely was made for news consumption.
That meant that there was a media circus, and Carter was feeling harassed and hampered by the attentions of the media, attempting to make the situation more comfortable. Lord Carnarvon negotiated an exclusive deal with the Times of London to report on the tomb as it was being cleared. The exclusive contract meant that because they weren't getting the news firsthand, the other newspapers were looking for other angles on the story.
It seems that some reporters were envious of the fact that Carter and Carnarvon had given exclusivity to the Times newspaper when it came to first dibs on reporting news from the tomb, and looking for scoops of their own, journalists chose to create this idea of a curse.
But what of the man who made the historic discovery of the tomb? What did he make of the dreaded curse?
Howard Carter really didn't believe there was any kind of curse associated with his discovery. In fact, he called it Tommy rot. But when he died, it kind of opened up this whole can of worms, and all the media went crazy saying the curse had eventually got the discoverer.
One thing above all kind of gives us the lie to this, and that's the man who opened the tomb himself, Howard Carter. He went on to live a fairly regularly healthy life. In fact, when he died of natural causes, not a curse. And he wasn't alone. If you add up the number of people who were involved in the excavation, in the digs, and in the work thereafter, there were more than 80 of them. The vast, vast majority of those people went on to live long, healthy, and perfectly happy lives.
A Victorian girls' college in leafy Surrey is the last place you might expect to find a haunted painting that the students believe holds a terrible curse.
Man proposes, God disposes is a truly dark and violent painting, standing 8 feet wide by 3 feet tall. It's an incredibly striking visualization of violence, desolation, and it's really a symbol as well of Victorian imperial hubris.
The painting Man Proposes, God Disposes was painted in 1864. Edwin Landseer was Queen Victoria's favourite painter, probably best known today for his magnificent Red Highland stag painting, Monarch of the Glen, which has appeared on everything from chocolate boxes to T-shirts.
The painting is huge. You have to understand it's quite large-scale work, and it shows this ice-filled terrain. There's a mast of a ship which has fallen, crashed onto 2 icebergs, and then these 2 really terrifying-looking grizzly polar bears, one ripping at the sail and one chewing a human bone. When the critics saw it, they were impressed by its sublime qualities, the way it terrified when you looked at it, and it caused a sensation.
It visualizes an imagined scene from the aftermath of a doomed Arctic expedition. The expedition by Captain Sir John Franklin set out in 1845 to try and navigate a way through the Northwest Passage in Canada.
He set off with a crew of 129 men from Kent in May 1845. He was endowed with 2 great warships, HMS Terror and HMS Erebus. The crew and the ships were last seen off the coast of Greenland in July that year.
Franklin's 2 ships became trapped in ice, and they were trapped in that ice field for more than a year. Within that first year, Franklin himself and dozens of his crew members died. And at the end of the year, when the rest of the crew set out across the ice, trying to strike their way to what they hope would be salvation, they disappeared, never to be seen again.
By 1848, campaigns by the wives and family members of Franklin's crew inspired a search and rescue mission to take place. This was led by Sir John Richardson and Sir John Ray. It was only in 1853 that Ray came across an Inuit party wearing equipment that he recognized could be from the missing Franklin expedition.
And discovered that they had indeed come across Franklin's party in 1850 and explained that their ships had hit ice. However, when the Inuits passed the camp again, they came across a more gruesome scene, discovering only human remains.
But does this troubling painting have as much to do with what was going on in Landseer's mind when he painted it, as it does with the tragic fate of the men of the doomed Franklin expedition?
It's a painting from the latter part of his career, and he's not in the very best of health. He had a breakdown in the 1840s, after which he never entirely recovered mentally. He became incredibly hypochondriac, and he also self-medicated with morphia, which was very common in those days, and drank quite a lot of wine on top of that. In his last years, he was would certainly have been defined as mad, and he became increasingly unhappy when he finally died. Queen Victoria was not alone in feeling that it was a happy release.
Thomas Holloway purchased the painting in 1881 when it came up for auction and paid £6,616 for it, which at the time was the highest price that had ever been paid for a contemporary painting.
The painting hung in the picture gallery until in the 1920s, they began to use the picture gallery as a good space for taking exams.
Shortly after its arrival at the college, rumours started to swirl about headaches, nightmares, and general feelings of doom inspired by the picture. The beady eyes of the polar bears and their ferocious grimaces were accused of making students so disturbed that they would fail their exams.
To be fair, when the students were sitting the exams, they would literally have been sitting on eye level with the polar bear that is enthusiastically chewing what is quite clearly a human rib. So you can see how the sensitive might have been made anxious by this.
According to this story, in the late 1920s or early 1930s, a student, and stories vary whether it was a male student or a female student, was sitting their exam beneath the painting on the wall in the hall. And the student went mad. The student stared into the eyes of Landseer's voracious polar bears, lost his or her mind, and committed suicide by the novel method of stabbing a pencil into their own eye, but not, according to this story, before they had managed to inscribe on the exam paper, "The polar bears made me do it."
A superstition grew up that any student who sat next to the picture would automatically fail their exams.
This got so bad that students started to refuse to sit their exams next to the painting, and the poor college registrar, wanting to get on with the programme, was forced to come up with a solution. He resolved to cover the painting, and the only fabric they could find large enough was the college's Union Jack flag. This is a tradition that we still maintain today.
Landseer would have loved the story because among his passions was all things occult and supernatural. So to find his own painting at the centre of a ghost story would have given him tremendous pleasure.
A tremendous pleasure for Landseer, perhaps, but not for the students forced to sit exams under its baleful gaze.
Man proposes, God disposes seems the epitome of a cursed painting, a painting of a cursed expedition, painted by a man who eventually went mad and passing on that bad luck to any student that comes into contact with it. It's also a powerful image of a bleak environment. In a sense, I would say that it is a painting essential to today, that its image of man's failure in the face of the wild speaks to all sorts of environmental concerns, and it may be that the curse isn't over yet.
Our last cursed treasure takes us to Scotland, where an ancient relic that was the symbol of a nation elicited the desire of an envious king who craved its power for himself. But in doing so, may he have brought a curse on his own kingdom.
Very few artifacts in Britain's long and troubled history are as steeped in high politics and controversy as the Stone of Destiny, also known as the Stone of Scone. And yet to look at it, you wouldn't imagine that. It's a fairly unimpressive block of sandstone, just 26 inches by 16 inches by 10 inches. So it's not huge, and there's a crude cross carved in the top of it. Yet that fairly modest appearance belies its long and frankly extraordinary history.
The Stone of Scone, commonly called the Stone of Destiny, is probably the most powerful, significant and emotionally alive rock in the British Isles. There are a lot of colourful stories told about the Stone of Scone. One is that it's the Stone of Destiny of Irish mythology, on which the kings of Tara, the High Kings of Ireland, were inaugurated, brought to Scotland in legend by the first King of Scots.
Well, the Stone of Destiny, or the Stone of Scone, as it's very often known, was said to have been brought here in 843 AD by Kenneth MacAlpin after he defeated the Picts and then became the first King of Scots.
All the Scottish kings from Kenneth MacAlpin onwards, including all the famous ones you read about, like Macbeth, Robert the Bruce, it was very important that kings were crowned on it. It gave legitimacy to their claim to be kings. It was really in the heart of everything that Scotland was about.
If we try to understand the importance of the stone, in many ways we have to go back to the Middle Ages. Edward I conquered Wales, he set out to conquer Scotland, and in both cases he took from the countries their symbols of nationhood. One of these was the Stone of Destiny. This was the stone on which the Scottish kings were inaugurated. And he wanted it for himself, and he wanted it to destroy the very notion of Scottishness.
Edward I took it down to London and commissioned a special chair and had it placed in Westminster Abbey, and the stone had a special place under the chair that future kings could then sit on.
In 1328, which was just over 30 years after the English had got it, they agreed to hand it back to the Scots. But the Londoners rioted rather than allow this to happen, and so the stone remained at Westminster Abbey.
So for the next 6 centuries, after this deal was reneged on, the stone remained in London. It has been the most fundamental part of the royal coronation ceremonies for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And it's little wonder then that this stone, this otherwise unimpressive piece of sandstone, has been invested with such mythical significance.
The stone's significance became a curse when, as a symbol of the power of the church and the state, it became a target for those wanting to challenge the established order.
In 1914, suffragettes campaigning to get votes for women planted a bomb near the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey in order to damage a symbol of male power. And the stone was in fact quite badly split by it. The split, however, didn't break it.
In the middle of the century, another old wound was reopened when Scots, seeking to break away from the Union, sought to use the stone to forge a separate destiny.
In 1950, the 3 Glasgow students decided that they wanted to make a statement, political or patriotic statement, and what they decided to do was to repatriate the Stone of Destiny from Westminster Abbey.
On Christmas Day, in the early hours of Christmas morning, 1950, 4 students from Glasgow broke in through a tradesman's entrance, and they made their way to the coronation chair. And from the little platform which sits beneath the chair, they removed the Stone of Destiny. But in doing so, they dropped it. And it fell onto the flags, the flagstone floor of the Abbey, and broke. It broke along the fracture line which had been created by the suffragettes' bomb. The students grabbed the 2 pieces of stone and dashed out of the Abbey to a getaway car they had waiting outside. And they put the bits of stone in the car and were just about to drive off when they were spotted by a policeman. And he watched them and was suspicious. Brilliantly quick thinking, Two of the students, a man and a woman, pretended to be lovers, and they kissed passionately and extravagantly in front of this copper, and that put him off. He asked a few questions and then let them go. The students drove off, intending to take the stone straight back to Scotland, but the car they were in was old and not terribly strong, and the stone was heavy. They had to stop in the Midlands, and they buried the bigger half of the stone in a field and deposited the smaller half with friends. And they came back a couple of weeks later, recovered both pieces, took it back to Scotland and repaired it. Inevitably, this became a huge press story. When police picked the students up, 3 of the 4 students said, "Yes, we did this." The decision was taken in London. This is far too politically incendiary to allow to go to court. We cannot have a prosecution, not if we don't want Scottish nationalism to rise up and consume us. And so no action was taken against those students.
By the 1990s, the desire for Scottish independence had become so strong that the Westminster government decided that a gesture of goodwill towards the Scottish people was in order.
The English and Scottish governments struck a deal whereby the stone is sent back to live in Scotland for most of its time, but it's still brought down to Westminster for the coronation of British monarchs.
I was asked to make arrangements for the stone to be brought back from Westminster back to Scotland. Once it came back to Scotland and was put on display in the Crown Room at Edinburgh Castle, I received an enormous amount of email and letters telling me that it wasn't the real thing. There are some interesting, slightly controversial stories about possibly the monks at Scone Abbey made it to give to Edward I as a sop.
In 1295, Edward I came up to Scotland. Everybody knew he was coming, and the abbot probably didn't give him the stone that Edward I was looking for. He had plenty of time to hide it, remove it, and it is very much thought that he gave him a different stone, which Scots might joke about being the top of the cesspit.
Whether it is the real stone or not, the stone of destiny has cast its spell on all those who possess or desire it. And in the process, it has become an important symbol of national identity.
It has quietly, over time, helped drive forward Scottish nationalism, and therefore, and ultimately probably, bring about the division of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, whether that's a curse or a blessing depends entirely on your political point of view.